When it comes to a gene is a portion or segment of DNA controlling one particular characteristic. So one gene is controlling one characteristic, okay? One gene. And I drew a chromosome in the previous video. So this is a chromosome. And remember that this chromosome is made up of two sister chromatids. So I'll demarcate there. This one is coming from the father. This one is coming from the mother. So on these two sister chromatids, for the one which is of the father, on it there are genes that belong to the father. Then on the one for the mother, there are genes that belong to the mother. But what we should understand is that the genes that are on the same position but on different sister chromatids, they control the same characteristic. So if this gene is controlling height, okay, so if let me change the color. If this gene is controlling height, then this gene is also controlling height. If this gene is controlling skin tone, then this gene is also controlling skin tone. So the genes that are on the same position but on different sister chromatids, they control the same characteristic. We need to understand that. Rewind the video. I know I'm a bit fast because I'm preventing this video to be too long. So you can just rewind it and listen to it again. So the genes that are on two different sister chromatids but on the same position, they are controlling the same characteristic. So I will stick with height as an example. But what we need to understand here is that a gene is a portion or segment, okay, on a chromosome, which is controlling a characteristic. So this is just a portion. It is just like a portion on a chromosome, and it is controlling a characteristic. So genes control characteristics. These characteristics can be height, So these characteristics can be height, it can be, color of the eyes, ears, how your ears are shaped, whatever characteristic you can think of, those characteristics are controlled by genes. So a gene is a portion on a chromosome. All right, my students. Now, when it comes to alleles, what they do, what is an allele? According to this definition here, an allele is simply an alternative form of a given gene. It is an alternative form of a given gene. What they simply mean here is that an allele is representing a gene. It is another form of a gene. Okay, so alleles are simply used to represent what a gene is controlling. In short, alleles are simply letters that represent what a gene is controlling. So in the previous slide, we had a chromosome. Okay, let me try to draw a chromosome again. Let me create some space here if I can. Okay, so let's say we've got a chromosome, right? We're saying that alleles are letters, These letters, they represent what a gene is controlling. And remember, always remember that a chromosome is made up of two sister chromatids, one coming from the father, another one coming from the mother. So we've got a gene here and a gene here. So when it comes to writing, how can we represent what these two genes are controlling? How can we do that? So we need to use letters to simply represent what these two genes are controlling. So the gene which is on the father's side, what is it controlling? We agreed to say height, isn't it? Yes. So in this case, let's say the father is tall and the mother is short. Okay? So the gene on the father's side is controlling tallness, which is height. On the mother's side, we've got another gene which is controlling shortness, which is also height. So you see, the characteristic is the same. The characteristic is height, but the father is tall, the mother is short. But that's what? Height. They both fall under one characteristic. It can be like skin tone. Skin tone is a characteristic. It's either muntu no sweater or no fipa. They're two different things, but yonse ni machan ni ma skin tone. So it's the same even here. Height, but the gene on the father's side is controlling tallness, the gene on the mother's side is controlling shortness. So now, how do we represent this? How do we represent this? That's where alleles come in. We use alleles to represent what a gene is controlling. So alleles are simply letters that are used to represent what a gene is controlling. So if I want to talk about height, which is for the father, tallness, I am going to say, okay, let's use capital letter T. This letter is an allele for the father. This letter, T, it is an allele for the father. Okay? So we're going to say, okay, let us use S. Let us use S to represent what to represent the height or the characteristic which is being controlled by the gene for the mother. So we're going to say, okay, we're going to use letter S. That is also what? A letter. So you see, we've got this letter, which is T, representing this letter, which is T, representing what this gene is controlling. And then we've got this letter S, representing what this other gene is controlling. So an allele is simply an alternative form of a gene. It is a letter used to represent what a gene is controlling. So capital letter T is simply telling us to say, oh, there is a gene there which is controlling tallness. Capital letter S is another letter which is used to show. It is used it's used to represent that, oh, there is a gene which is controlling a height which is shortness. I hope we are clear. So alleles are letters. It is an allele is simply an alternative form of a gene. So if you see, we've got two letters. Why? Because an individual will inherit two characteristics under one. It will inherit two genes for one characteristic. I'll repeat. We've got two letters. This is because an offspring will inherit two genes for one characteristics. We've got two letters. Because because with an offspring, mwana, when you say offspring, we're talking about mwana. An offspring will inherit two genes for one characteristic. So this capital letter T, it is an allele representing a gene. This capital letter S, it is an allele representing another gene. So that simply means majini nyangati yabiri. So there are two genes for one characteristic, which is height. So we always have two letters because an offspring will inherit two genes for one characteristic. Okay, so that's what alleles do. They simply represent what genes are controlling. Now, when we're talking about alleles, we've got dominant and recessive. A dominant allele is one that gets expressed in the phenotype to the exclusion of another. It is always represented by a capital letter. So a dominant allele ndija ina power. It has got power and it is expressed in the phenotype. It has got power and it is what? Expressed in the phenotype. While a recessive allele is one that is overshadowed in the phenotype by the presence of a dominant allele. So a recessive, it does not have power when it is in the presence of a dominant allele. It only has power if it's alone. Okay? If it's alone. So if an allele is dominant, it will be expressed outside in the phenotype. That's what we're going to see outside. But if it's not dominant, it is recessive, and it's in the presence of a dominant allele, it won't be expressed. So for example, we say, let capital letter T represent tallness. Okay, let capital letter T represent tallness, and small letter t to represent shortness. Capital letter T representing tallness, small letter t representing shortness. In this case, which characteristic is going to which Which gene is dominant? Tallness, isn't it? Tallness is dominant over shortness. So tallness is dominant and it is represented by capital letter T. Shortness is recessive and it is represented by a small letter, which is small letter t. So tallness is dominant over shortness. So in this case, the offspring, will the offspring be tall or short? The offspring will be tall because tallness is dominant while shortness is recessive. Are you following? So dominant alleles are represented by a capital letter, while recessive alleles are represented by a small letter. We need to understand this. Once taita apache nishitasova. So dominant alleles are represented by a capital letter. Recessive alleles are represented by a small letter. We shall continue in the next video.